I let my greedy children take the house, and that was the moment they finally showed me who they really were. The night Emily said it, the air at the dinner table felt colder than the early October wind outside the windows. My name is Margaret Lawson. I'm 72 years old, and I had lived in that house for 38 years. It was a modest two-story place in a quiet Ohio suburb, with white siding that Harold used to repaint every spring and a maple tree in the front yard that turned a deep red every fall. Harold planted that tree the year our son Daniel was born. Back then, the house felt full of laughter and the smell of Sunday pot roast. That night, though, the house felt like it belonged to strangers. Emily set her wine glass down with a small click and leaned back in her chair like she had already made a decision about something important. "Mom," she said, in that careful voice people use when they pretend to be kind, "this house is really too much for you now." Daniel stared at his plate while she spoke. He didn't interrupt her. He didn't even look at me. Outside, the porch light flickered against the dark yard, and I could see the outline of that old maple tree swaying slowly in the wind. I had watched that tree grow for decades, just like I had watched my son grow, and somehow the tree had stayed strong while my family had quietly drifted away from me. "You don't need all this space anymore," Emily continued. "The stairs are steep, the yard needs work, and honestly it would be safer if Daniel and I handled everything." The words were soft, but the meaning behind them was not. I folded my napkin slowly and placed it beside my plate. My hands looked older than they used to, the skin thinner, the veins more visible. Age has a way of making everything slower, including the moment you realize the people sitting across from you have already decided your future without asking. Daniel finally cleared his throat. "She's right, Mom," he said quietly. "You shouldn't have to worry about maintaining a whole house by yourself." He still didn't meet my eyes. I watched him carefully. This was the same boy who used to run through the front door after school shouting that he was starving. The same boy who once begged Harold to build him a treehouse in that maple tree. Now he sat across from me like a man discussing a business arrangement with a stranger. Emily reached across the table and placed her hand over Daniel's. It was a small gesture, but I noticed how quickly he relaxed when she touched him, as if he needed permission to keep talking. "We can take the house," she said. "You could stay here for a while if you want, of course. We'd make sure everything is handled. Bills, repairs, all of it." Her smile was polished and patient, the kind you see in real estate offices and bank lobbies. I had seen that smile many times before, usually right before she asked for something expensive. I looked around the dining room. The oak cabinet Harold built with his own hands still stood against the wall. The clock above the doorway still ticked softly, the same steady rhythm it had kept since 1991. Everything in that room held a memory, but suddenly it felt like I was the only one who remembered them. Daniel shifted in his chair. "It just makes sense," he added. "You wouldn't have to deal with anything anymore." For a moment no one spoke. The clock ticked. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen. Somewhere down the street a car door slammed. Then I smiled. "Fine," I said calmly. Emily blinked. "Fine. If you want the house," I continued, "you can have it." Daniel looked up then, surprised. Emily sat up straighter in her chair, clearly pleased with herself. "You mean that?" she asked. "Of course," I said. "I'm 72, Emily. Maybe it's time I stopped worrying about big houses and long staircases." Daniel exhaled, the tension leaving his shoulders almost instantly. It was remarkable how quickly relief can replace guilt when someone gives you exactly what you wanted. Emily reached for her wine again. "That's really generous of you," she said. "We'll start the paperwork this week." Generous. That word lingered in the air for a moment, as if it belonged to someone else entirely. I nodded slowly and took a sip of water. It tasted colder than usual. In the quiet that followed, Emily began talking about renovations. She mentioned knocking out the wall between the kitchen and dining room, repainting the living room, maybe even selling the house later if the market improved. Daniel nodded along with her ideas, occasionally adding a comment about property values or mortgage rates. Neither of them asked what I planned to do next. Neither of them wondered where I might go. I listened without interrupting. After all, when people believe they have already won, they usually stop paying attention. That night, after the dishes were cleared and Daniel and Emily went upstairs, I stayed alone at the kitchen table for a long time. The house was quiet except for the familiar creaks in the walls that always happened after midnight when the temperature dropped. I ran my hand across the smooth surface of the table Harold had bought at a small furniture store 35 years ago. He used to say this house would always protect our family. Back then I believed him. I finally stood and turned off the kitchen light. As I walked down the hallway toward my bedroom, the shadows stretched across the floor in long, quiet lines. At the end of the hall, I paused beside the window that looked out over the front yard. The maple tree was still there, its branches dark against the night sky. Daniel had once climbed that tree so many times Harold eventually nailed small wooden steps into the trunk. I could almost see the ghost of that little boy now, laughing and calling for his father to watch him climb higher. I wondered when exactly that boy had disappeared. The next morning, Emily began moving things around the house. By noon, she had already replaced the spare bedroom furniture with boxes labeled for storage. By evening, my belongings had quietly migrated toward the smallest room at the end of the hall. She called it temporary. Daniel said nothing. I watched them from the doorway while they discussed paint colors for the living room walls. For the first time in my life, I felt like a guest in the home where I had spent nearly 4 decades. And yet, strangely, I wasn't angry. Not really. Because while Emily and Daniel were busy planning their future inside that house, they had forgotten something very important. The house had a history they didn't fully understand. And sometimes history has a way of revealing itself when people least expect it. The first morning after I gave Daniel and Emily the house, I woke up. Earlier than usual, long before the sun had fully climbed above the rooftops across the street. The quiet in the house felt different now, like the kind of silence you hear in a hotel room rather than in a home that has belonged to you for decades. I lay in bed for a moment listening to the familiar sounds that had once comforted me. The low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen downstairs, the old heating vents clicking softly as the October air cooled the walls overnight. For 38 years those sounds had meant stability. Now they felt like reminders that everything had changed in a single conversation at the dinner table. I pushed the blankets aside and sat up slowly, giving my knees a moment to adjust the way they always needed to in the morning. Age teaches you patience in small ways. When I stepped into the hallway, the house already smelled faintly of fresh paint, which surprised me because it had not smelled that way the night before. Emily moved quickly when she decided something belonged to her. I walked toward the kitchen and paused halfway down the hall when I saw the living room door open. A tall aluminum ladder stood near the wall where Harold had hung our wedding photograph 39 years ago. The photograph was gone now. In its place, there was only a pale rectangle where the paint had not faded with time. Emily was standing on the ladder wearing a light gray sweater and jeans, carefully brushing a new coat of white paint across the wall. She turned when she heard my footsteps and gave me a polite smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Good morning, Margaret," she said, as if we were neighbors who had just met at the mailbox. I nodded slowly and glanced at the empty space where the photograph used to hang. Harold and I had taken that photograph at a small studio downtown the year Daniel graduated from high school. The photographer had asked us to sit close together, and Harold had wrapped his arm around my shoulders the way he always did when he wanted me to feel safe. For nearly 2 decades, that photograph had greeted everyone who walked through our front door. Now it was probably sitting in a cardboard box somewhere in the garage. Emily stepped down from the ladder and placed the paintbrush into a metal tray. "Daniel thinks this color will make the room look bigger," she said casually. "People like open spaces these days." I folded my arms gently and looked around the room. The couch Harold bought in 1998 had already been pushed against the opposite wall. The old bookshelf he built himself was missing entirely. I wondered where it had gone, but I did not ask. Instead, I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a cup of coffee. The mug I chose was one Harold brought home from a roadside diner during a road trip we took through Pennsylvania years ago. The handle was slightly chipped, but I had never been able to throw it away. As I stood at the counter, the back door opened, and Daniel stepped inside carrying a cardboard box. He looked surprised to see me standing there. "Morning, Mom," he said, placing the box on the kitchen table. Inside the box, I could see several of my books stacked neatly together. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck the way he used to when he felt uncomfortable. "Emily thought it might be easier if we kept some of your things in storage for now," he explained. "Just until we finish reorganizing the house." Reorganizing. It was a polite word for replacing a lifetime with something more convenient. I took a sip of coffee and nodded as if the explanation made perfect sense. The coffee tasted slightly bitter, but the warmth steadied my hands. Daniel glanced toward the living room where Emily was moving the ladder again. She has a lot of ideas for the place, he added. I am sure she does, I replied quietly. Daniel lingered for a moment as if he wanted to say something else, but could not find the right words. Eventually, he picked up another box from the floor and carried it toward the hallway that led to the small room at the back of the house. That room used to be Daniel's bedroom when he was a boy. It had blue walls and a narrow window that faced the backyard. I followed him slowly and watched as he placed the box beside several others stacked near the closet. Looks like this will be your room for a while, he said. The phrase for a while hung in the air, like unfinished business. I looked around the room and remembered the posters of baseball players that once covered the walls. Daniel had begged Harold to install a small basketball hoop on the back of the door, and the marks from the ball hitting the wood were still faintly visible beneath the paint. Thank you, Daniel, I said calmly. He nodded and left the room quickly. When he disappeared down the hallway, I sat on the edge of the narrow bed and listened to the distant sound of Emily moving furniture across the living room floor. For the next few days, the house transformed piece by piece. Emily replaced the curtains in the kitchen with lighter fabric that she said felt more modern. Daniel rented a small truck one Saturday afternoon and loaded several pieces of Harold's old furniture into the back. They told me the items would be safer in storage, but I noticed they did not ask where I thought those pieces should go. By the end of the week, the house no longer looked the way it had when Harold was alive. Even the maple tree outside seemed different when I looked at it through the window because the new curtains filtered the sunlight into softer shapes. One afternoon, I heard Daniel and Emily talking in the living room while they believed I was resting in my room. The house had always carried sound easily through the vents, so their voices traveled down the hallway with surprising clarity. If we refinanced the property next year, we could probably get enough equity to buy a bigger place, Emily said thoughtfully. Daniel hesitated. Are you sure that is a good idea right away? The market might change. Emily laughed quietly. Daniel, this house is practically ours now. Your mother already signed everything. There is nothing stopping us. I remained still on the bed while their conversation continued. The ceiling fan turned slowly above me, making a soft ticking sound with every rotation. I closed my eyes for a moment and thought about Harold. He used to say that houses remember things long after people forget them. At the time, I believed he was talking about memories and family stories. Now I wondered if he meant something much more practical. Because while Daniel and Emily were busy planning their future around the house they believed belonged to them, they had overlooked something important hidden quietly in the past, something Harold had prepared years ago without ever mentioning it to either of them. And I had a feeling that sooner or later that forgotten detail would find its way back into the light. The following morning, the house felt even quieter than usual, but it was the kind of quiet that comes when people are busy planning something they believe you do not understand. I woke before sunrise again, the pale blue light slipping through the thin curtains of the small bedroom at the end of the hall. For a moment, I simply listened to the sounds of the house, the distant creak of a floorboard upstairs, and the soft whir of the furnace turning on as the October air cooled overnight. The house had its own rhythm, and after 38 years I could tell when something in that rhythm had changed. I dressed slowly and walked toward the kitchen, moving carefully so the hallway floor would not announce every step. As I reached the corner near the staircase, I heard voices drifting down from the living room. Daniel and Emily were already awake. Emily's voice carried the most clearly. We should talk to the bank next week, she said in a low but confident tone. If we refinance early, we could use the equity from the house as a down payment somewhere better. Daniel sounded hesitant. Do you really think we should move that quickly? We just finished transferring everything. Emily laughed softly, the way people laugh when they think the outcome is already guaranteed. Daniel, this place is ours now. Your mother already gave it to us. There is nothing complicated about it. I remained still in the hallway, my hand resting lightly against the wall beside the staircase. It was interesting how easily people reveal their intentions when they believe no one else is listening. The sunlight began creeping across the hardwood floor as the morning brightened, and for a moment I remembered another morning long ago when Daniel had raced down these same stairs wearing a baseball glove and shouting that he was late for practice. Back then the house had echoed with energy and laughter. Now the same staircase carried quiet conversations about property values and mortgage terms. I stepped into the kitchen and poured myself a cup of coffee, allowing the cabinet doors to close, just loudly enough to let them know I was awake. The voices in the living room stopped immediately. A few seconds later, Daniel appeared in the doorway. "Morning, Mom," he said. He tried to sound relaxed, but there was a tightness in his voice that had not been there years ago. "Good morning, Daniel," I replied. Emily followed him a moment later, already dressed in a crisp sweater and dark jeans, as if she had somewhere important to be. She smiled politely and leaned against the counter. "We were just talking about improvements to the house," she said. "There are a lot of possibilities now." I nodded and stirred my coffee slowly. The spoon tapped gently against the side of the mug. "Improvements are always exciting," I said. Daniel sat at the table and glanced toward Emily before speaking again. "Emily thinks we should eventually sell the place and move somewhere closer to the city," he explained. "Better schools, better property values." Emily straightened slightly, as if the conversation had become a presentation. "Houses like this are good investments if you handle them properly," she said. "We could probably increase the value quite a bit in a year or two." I watched them quietly while they spoke. It was not anger that filled the room, but something more complicated, a mixture of ambition and certainty that the future had already been decided. After a moment, Emily checked the time on her phone. "I have a meeting later," she said. "Daniel, can you call the bank this afternoon and ask about refinancing options?" Daniel nodded. "Sure. I will look into it." They finished breakfast quickly and left the kitchen together, their voices fading toward the front door as they discussed paint colors and real estate listings. When the door closed, the house returned to its familiar silence. I finished my coffee slowly and carried the mug to the sink. Through the window above the sink, I could see the maple tree in the front yard. Its leaves had turned a deep red now, the kind of red that only appears for a few weeks each fall before the branches become bare again. Harold always loved that tree. He said it reminded him that time moves in seasons, not in straight lines. Later that afternoon, I decided to take a walk through the neighborhood. The sidewalks were lined with fallen leaves and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke from someone's fireplace. As I passed the small park at the end of the street, I saw a group of children kicking a soccer ball across the grass while their parents watched from folding chairs. For a moment, I imagined Daniel there as a boy again, running toward the ball with his shoelaces untied and his hair falling into his eyes. It was strange how easily memory can make the present feel distant. When I returned home, the sun was beginning to set, and the house glowed with warm light through the front windows. Daniel's car was already parked in the driveway. Inside, I found him sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop open and several papers spread across the surface. He looked up when I entered. "Hey, Mom," he said. "I was just talking with the bank." I placed my coat over the back of a chair. "That sounds productive." Daniel rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "They said we might need to confirm the ownership details before moving forward with refinancing. Apparently, they need to review the property documents again. Emily says it is probably just routine paperwork." I nodded slowly and sat across from him. "Banks like to be thorough," I said. Daniel seemed relieved by my calm reaction. "Yes, exactly. It should not take long." He gathered the papers into a neat stack and closed the laptop. "Emily is meeting with a contractor tomorrow about the kitchen renovation. She wants to open the space up more." I looked toward the doorway that led into the dining room, where Harold and I had shared thousands of meals over the years. "Change happens quickly sometimes," I said quietly. Daniel did not respond immediately. He simply nodded and carried the papers upstairs to show Emily. That night, I returned to the small bedroom at the end of the hall and sat by the window for a long time watching the moonlight settle over the quiet street. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn echoed across the dark fields beyond town. Harold used to say that people often mistake silence for weakness, when in truth silence is simply patience waiting for the right moment. As I sat there, I realized something important. Daniel and Emily believed the story of the house was already finished. They believed the papers had been signed and the future belonged to them. But houses carry history the same way old trees carry rings hidden inside their trunks. And sooner or later, someone always discovers what those rings reveal. The next morning began quietly, but the kind of quiet that carries the weight of something waiting just beneath the surface. Sunlight stretched slowly across the hallway floor as I stepped out of the small bedroom at the end of the hall. The boards beneath my feet creaked softly the way they always had, the same sound they made when Daniel was a boy running through the house on Saturday mornings. Some sounds never change, even when the people inside the house do. As I reached the kitchen, I noticed that the dining table was already covered with papers. Several printed documents lay neatly stacked beside Daniel's laptop. Emily stood at the counter pouring coffee into two tall travel mugs while Daniel studied the paperwork with a furrowed expression. They both looked up when I entered the room. "Good morning, Margaret," Emily said, with that same polite tone she had been using all week. Daniel nodded. "Morning, Mom." I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat quietly at the far end of the table. The smell of fresh paper and printer ink filled the air. Emily slid one of the mugs toward Daniel and leaned over his shoulder to read the top page. "The contractor is coming at 11, she said. "We should finalize the kitchen plans today." Daniel nodded distractedly. "I'm still looking at these documents from the bank. They want confirmation of the ownership records before they move forward." Emily waved her hand dismissively. "That is just routine. Banks ask for extra paperwork all the time." Daniel tapped the edge of the page with his finger. "Still, it is strange. They said the property file has a note attached to it that they need to review." Emily frowned slightly, but quickly forced a smile. "That is probably something left over from when your father set up the mortgage years ago. Those files stay in the system forever." Daniel seemed partially reassured by her explanation. He leaned back in his chair and took a sip of coffee. "Well, they asked me to send a few more documents just to be safe." Emily glanced at me briefly before returning her attention to Daniel. "That should not be a problem," she said. Everything was already signed. I stirred my coffee slowly while listening to their conversation. The small metal spoon made a quiet sound against the ceramic mug. Outside the kitchen window, the maple tree in the front yard swayed gently in the autumn wind, scattering a few red leaves across the lawn. Harold used to rake those leaves every Sunday afternoon, while Daniel helped pile them into tall mounds. The memory came back so clearly that for a moment I almost expected to see them both outside the window again. Emily checked her watch and grabbed her coat from the back of the chair. "I need to meet the contractor," she said. "Daniel, send those documents to the bank this afternoon so we can move forward." Daniel nodded. "Sure." Emily walked toward the front door, but paused before leaving. "Margaret," she said, turning toward me again, "if you need anything today, just let us know. We will be busy with the renovation plans, but we can help later." I smiled faintly. "Thank you, Emily." The front door closed behind her a moment later, and the house returned to its familiar silence. Daniel gathered the papers into a neat stack and slid them into a folder. The bank representative sounded a little confused on the phone, he admitted after a moment. Something about needing to review older legal records connected to the property. I nodded calmly. "Sometimes houses carry complicated histories," I said. Daniel looked puzzled, but shrugged. "It will probably clear up quickly." He stood and carried the folder upstairs to his office. I remained at the kitchen table, watching the sunlight move slowly across the floorboards. Hours passed quietly. Around midday, I heard Daniel talking on the phone in the living room. His voice was low, but the hallway carried sound easily. "Yes, I understand," he said. "You need to verify the trust record." There was a pause as he listened to the person on the other end of the line. "A trust," he repeated. "No, I am not familiar with that." Another pause followed, longer this time. I could almost imagine the expression forming on his face. "My father handled most of the paperwork years ago," Daniel continued. "I will check with the attorney if necessary." When the call ended, he remained silent for several minutes. Eventually, he walked into the kitchen, holding the phone loosely in his hand. "Mommy," said slowly, "do you remember if Dad ever mentioned something called a property trust connected to the house?" I looked up from my coffee mug and met his eyes. "Harold always liked to organize things carefully," I replied. Daniel frowned slightly. "The bank said there might be an old trust document attached to the property file, but they need to verify it with the attorney who handled the estate." He rubbed his forehead thoughtfully. "I do not remember signing anything like that." I folded my hands calmly on the table. "Sometimes legal details take time to understand," I said. Daniel nodded uncertainly and glanced toward the living room, as if expecting Emily to walk back through the door at any moment. "The contractor will be here soon," he muttered. "I should focus on the renovation plans." But even as he said it, I could see the doubt beginning to settle quietly behind his eyes. The rest of the afternoon passed with a strange tension hanging in the air. Daniel moved around the house measuring walls and discussing cabinets with the contractor, while Emily returned with samples of tile and paint. They spoke enthusiastically about modern designs and open spaces, but every so often Daniel would pause and glance toward the folder of documents sitting on the kitchen counter. Late that evening, when the contractor finally left and the house grew quiet again, Daniel opened the folder once more. Emily leaned over his shoulder as he read the bank's email message on the screen. The message was short but clear. The property file indicates the existence of a trust agreement connected to the residence. Please contact the original attorney to review the legal status of the property before continuing with refinancing procedures. Emily read the sentence twice and then straightened slowly. That does not make sense, she said under her breath. Daniel looked just as uncertain. I will call the attorney tomorrow, he replied quietly. Across the room, I sat in the living room chair near the window, watching the last light of the day fade behind the maple tree outside. The branches swayed gently against the darkening sky and the leaves rustled softly in the wind. Harold once told me that careful planning is like planting a tree. You may not see the full shape of it for years, but eventually its branches stretch farther than anyone expects. And as Daniel and Emily studied the message on the screen that night, I realized that Harold's old plans were beginning to grow into the light once again. The following morning the house felt heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves were listening. I woke before sunrise again and sat quietly beside the window in the small bedroom that used to belong to Daniel when he was a boy. The air carried the cool smell of autumn, and somewhere down the street a delivery truck rumbled past slowly. For many years my mornings had followed the same rhythm. Harold would wake first, start the coffee pot, and open the kitchen window to let in the crisp morning air. Now the house belonged to a different rhythm entirely, one that revolved around renovation plans and property documents instead of quiet breakfasts and newspaper pages. When I stepped into the hallway, I could already hear Daniel moving around downstairs. The sound of cabinet doors opening and closing echoed faintly through the floorboards. By the time I reached the kitchen, he was standing at the counter staring at his phone with a worried look that he tried unsuccessfully to hide when he noticed me entering the room. "Morning, Mom," he said quickly. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down at the table. The folder containing the property documents was open in front of him again. Several printed pages were spread across the table, each one marked with notes written in Daniel's hurried handwriting. "Did you sleep well?" he asked. I nodded calmly. The house has always been quiet in the mornings. Daniel hesitated before speaking again. "I called the bank early today," he said. "They confirmed that there is definitely some kind of trust attached to the property records." I stirred my coffee slowly while listening. The spoon made a soft sound against the mug. "What did they say about it?" I asked. Daniel sighed and rubbed his forehead. "They told me the trust document was created years ago by the attorney who handled Dad's legal paperwork. Apparently, the house was placed into something called a family trust before the mortgage was even fully paid off." He paused for a moment. "The bank representative said the trust might affect whether the property can be refinanced or transferred the way we planned." I nodded thoughtfully, but did not appear surprised. "Legal structures can be complicated," I said quietly. Emily entered the kitchen at that moment carrying her tablet and a stack of renovation magazines. She placed them on the table beside Daniel and glanced at the documents scattered across the surface. "What did the bank say?" she asked. Daniel leaned back in his chair. "They want to review the trust agreement with the attorney who originally created it." Emily frowned immediately. "That seems unnecessary. The property was already transferred to us." Daniel shook his head slowly. "That is what I thought too, but the bank said the trust might still control certain decisions about the house." Emily crossed her arms. "That does not make sense. Margaret already signed everything." Daniel glanced at me briefly and then back at Emily. "The bank said we should contact Dad's old attorney to confirm the details before moving forward." Emily exhaled sharply and pulled a chair out from the table. "Fine," she said. "Call the attorney today and get it sorted out. This renovation schedule cannot keep getting delayed because of old paperwork." Daniel picked up his phone again and scrolled through his contacts. "I think the attorney's name was Carter," he said. "Dad worked with him for years." Emily nodded impatiently. "Then call him." Daniel stood and walked into the living room where the signal was stronger. Through the open doorway, I could hear his voice clearly as he dialed the number. "Hello, this is Daniel Lawson," he said politely. "I believe my father Harold Lawson worked with your office several years ago regarding some property documents." There was a brief pause as he listened to the response. "Yes, that is correct," Daniel continued. "The property is the house on Maple Street. I am calling because the bank mentioned something about a trust agreement connected to the property." The conversation lasted several minutes. Emily tapped her fingers impatiently on the kitchen table while she waited. Finally, Daniel returned with a strange expression on his face. Well, he said slowly, "Mr. Carter remembers the trust." Emily leaned forward immediately. "Good, then he can confirm everything is fine." Daniel hesitated. Actually, he asked if we could come into his office tomorrow morning to review the documents in person. Emily looked confused. Why in person? Daniel shrugged. He said the trust contains several conditions, and he wants to make sure we understand them correctly. Emily glanced at me for a brief moment before looking back at Daniel. That seems excessive, she said. Daniel sighed quietly. The bank will not approve any refinancing until the attorney verifies the trust details. Emily leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms again. Fine, she said sharply. We will meet with him tomorrow and clear this up. I remained silent while they discussed the appointment. Outside the kitchen window, the maple tree rustled gently as a light breeze moved through its branches. A few more red leaves drifted down onto the grass. Harold used to say that trees are patient teachers. They grow quietly year after year, while people rush around beneath them, believing everything must happen quickly. Later that afternoon, Daniel and Emily spent hours reviewing renovation plans again, but their enthusiasm seemed slightly diminished. Every so often, Daniel would glance toward the folder of legal documents resting on the counter. By evening, the sun had dipped low enough that long shadows stretched across the living room floor. Emily finally closed her tablet with a frustrated sigh. We will sort this out tomorrow, she said. Once the attorney confirms the trust does not affect the property, we can move forward. Daniel nodded, but his voice lacked the certainty it had carried earlier in the week. Yes, tomorrow should clarify everything. That night, I returned to the small bedroom at the end of the hallway and sat beside the window again, watching the quiet street outside. The moon rose slowly above the rooftops, and the maple tree cast a long shadow across the lawn. Harold once told me that the best plans are the ones that wait quietly until the right moment arrives. As I looked out at the tree he planted decades ago, I realized that moment was drawing closer. Because the meeting with Mr. Carter the next morning would finally bring the past back into the room. And when that happened, Daniel and Emily would discover that the story of the house was far more complicated than they had ever imagined. The next morning arrived with a gray sky hanging low over the neighborhood, the kind of sky that makes the entire street look quieter than usual. I woke before the alarm on Daniel's phone could echo down the hallway, and sat for a moment on the edge of the narrow bed in the small room that had once belonged to him as a boy. For a few seconds, I simply listened to the house. Somewhere downstairs, a cabinet door closed softly. A kettle began to hum on the stove. The familiar sounds reminded me that the house was still standing exactly where it had stood for nearly 4 decades, even if the people inside it were beginning to see it differently. When I stepped into the hallway, I noticed Daniel already dressed in a dark jacket, pacing slowly between the living room and the kitchen. Emily stood near the front door, checking something on her phone, while tapping her foot impatiently against the hardwood floor. They both looked up when I entered the room. Good morning, Mom, Daniel said quickly, although his voice carried the distracted tone of someone whose mind was somewhere else entirely. Emily forced a polite smile. We have the meeting with Mr. Carter in about 40 minutes, she said. Daniel glanced at his watch. Traffic might be heavy this morning, so we should leave soon. I nodded calmly and poured myself a cup of coffee. The steam rose slowly from the mug and curled into the air above the kitchen table. Emily grabbed her coat and stepped closer to Daniel. We will finally clear up this trust issue today, she said firmly. Once the attorney confirms everything, we can move forward with the bank. Daniel nodded but did not look fully convinced. He picked up the folder of documents from the table and flipped through the pages again, as if hoping the answers might suddenly appear between the lines. The drive across town felt unusually quiet. I sat in the back seat of Daniel's car while he navigated through the morning traffic. The streets were lined with trees that had already begun shedding their red and yellow leaves across the sidewalks. Emily spent most of the ride reviewing renovation plans on her tablet, while Daniel kept glancing toward the folder resting on the passenger seat beside him. Neither of them spoke much during the drive. Mr. Carter's office was located in an older brick building near the courthouse downtown. Harold had brought me there several times years ago when he was organizing the family finances after Daniel started college. The building looked exactly the same as I remembered, with tall windows and a narrow staircase leading up to the second floor. When we stepped inside the office, the receptionist greeted Daniel politely and asked us to wait in a small conference room. The room smelled faintly of old books and polished wood. A large window looked out over the courthouse lawn, where a few people were crossing the street with briefcases in their hands. Emily sat down immediately and placed her tablet on the table. Daniel set the folder of documents beside it and began flipping through the pages again. I remained standing near the window watching the leaves drift slowly across the pavement outside. After a few minutes, the door opened and Mr. Carter stepped into the room. He was older than the last time I had seen him, his hair now completely silver, but his posture remained straight and deliberate. "Margaret," he said warmly as he extended his hand. "It has been a long time." I smiled gently. "It certainly has." Daniel stood quickly and shook the attorney's hand. "Thank you for meeting with us on short notice, Mr. Carter," he said. "We wanted to clarify some details about the property trust connected to the house." Mr. Carter nodded and took a seat at the head of the table. "Yes, I understand. The bank contacted my office yesterday asking about the documentation." Emily leaned forward immediately. "We were told the property might be inside some kind of trust, but we already transferred the house to our names last week," she said confidently. Mr. Carter opened a leather folder and removed several pages of legal documents. "The house is indeed part of a family trust your father established many years ago," he explained calmly. Daniel frowned slightly. "I do not remember signing anything related to a trust." Mr. Carter adjusted his glasses and slid one of the pages across the table. "That is because the trust was structured to operate independently of standard ownership transfers," he said. Emily blinked. "What does that mean exactly?" The attorney folded his hands neatly on the table. "It means the property cannot be sold, refinanced, or legally controlled without approval from the trustee named in the agreement." Daniel looked confused. "Who is the trustee?" Mr. Carter turned his gaze toward me. "The trustee is Margaret Lawson." For a moment the room became very quiet. Daniel stared at the document as if reading it again might change the words printed on the page. Emily leaned closer to the table and scanned the lines carefully. "That cannot be correct," she said quickly. "Margaret signed the house over to us." Mr. Carter nodded calmly. "The transfer you completed last week allows you to live in the house and maintain the property, but the trust still holds legal authority over any major financial decisions regarding it." Daniel looked up slowly. "You mean we cannot refinance the house without Mom's approval?" Mr. Carter answered with the same steady voice. "That is correct." Emily's expression tightened. "But the house is in our names now." The attorney shook his head slightly. "The trust structure ensures that Margaret Lawson retains final authority while she is alive. It was designed that way by your father to protect the property from being sold or leveraged without her consent." Daniel leaned back in his chair, clearly struggling to process the information. I watched him quietly while the afternoon light streamed through the window beside us. Outside, the courthouse lawn remained calm and unchanged, as if nothing significant had happened at all. Inside the room, however, something invisible had shifted. For the first time since that dinner conversation weeks earlier, Daniel and Emily were beginning to realize that the story of the house was not as simple as they had believed. For several seconds after Mr. Carter finished speaking, no one said anything. The quiet in the conference room felt different from the silence at home. This silence carried weight, the kind that settles over a room when people suddenly realize they may have misunderstood something important. Daniel stared at the document lying on the table in front of him as if the words might rearrange themselves if he looked long enough. Emily leaned closer to the page, her eyes moving quickly across the lines of legal language. I remained seated calmly beside the window, watching the reflection of the courthouse lawn in the glass, while the afternoon sunlight drifted slowly across the polished surface of the conference table. Daniel finally cleared his throat. "I do not understand," he said slowly. "The property deed was transferred to us last week." Mr. Carter nodded patiently. "Yes, the deed transfer allows you to occupy the house and manage daily maintenance. However, the trust agreement created by your father places certain protections around the property." Emily looked up sharply. "Protections from what exactly?" Mr. Carter folded his hands together and spoke with the steady tone of someone who had explained complicated legal matters many times before. "The trust was designed to prevent the house from being sold, refinanced, or used as collateral without approval from the trustee." Daniel rubbed his forehead again, a gesture I had seen him use since he was a teenager trying to solve a difficult math problem. "And the trustee is Mom," he said quietly. "That is correct," Mr. Carter replied. Emily sat back in her chair and crossed her arms. "But Margaret already agreed to give us the house," she said. Mr. Carter turned a page in the folder and slid another document across the table. "According to the trust agreement, Margaret Lawson retains full authority over financial decisions regarding the property, while she is alive. Daniel studied the document again, his eyebrows slowly drawing together. So even though the house is technically in our names, he said carefully, we cannot refinance it without Mom's approval. Mr. Carter nodded once more. That is correct. Emily's expression tightened slightly. That seems unnecessarily complicated, she said. Mr. Carter offered a small polite smile. Harold Lawson believed strongly in long-term security. He wanted to ensure that Margaret would always have a place to live regardless of future financial decisions made by anyone else. The words hung quietly in the air for a moment. Daniel leaned back in his chair and looked toward the window where the branches of a nearby oak tree moved gently in the wind outside. I remembered Harold saying something similar many years ago while standing in the backyard beneath our maple tree. He had always believed that stability should be built carefully, like the foundation of a house that might need to support generations. Emily tapped her fingers lightly against the table. If the trust only requires Margaret's approval, then we can simply move forward with refinancing once she signs the documents, she said confidently. Daniel glanced at me with an uncertain expression. Mr. Carter adjusted his glasses again before speaking. The trust also includes an additional clause, he explained. Emily stopped tapping her fingers. What kind of clause? Mr. Carter turned another page and pointed to a paragraph halfway down the document. This clause states that any financial transaction involving the property must be determined to be in the best interest of Margaret Lawson as evaluated by the trustee herself. Daniel blinked. So Mom has to decide whether the refinancing benefits her. Precisely, Mr. Carter replied. Emily frowned slightly. But the house already belongs to us. Mr. Carter shook his head gently. The trust structure means the house serves first as Margaret's residence and long-term security. Ownership transfers do not override the trustee's authority while the trust remains active. Daniel slowly exhaled as if the room had grown smaller around him. I could see the pieces beginning to fall into place behind his eyes. For weeks, he and Emily had been planning renovations and financial decisions with the confidence of people who believed the house was entirely theirs. Now that certainty was beginning to shift. Emily leaned forward again, her voice sharper this time. When does the trust end? Mr. Carter looked at the final page in the folder before answering. The trust remains active for the lifetime of Margaret Lawson. After that point, the property may be transferred without restriction to the listed beneficiaries. Daniel lowered his eyes to the document again. And until then, Mom controls any major decisions involving the house. Yes, Mr. Carter said calmly. That is exactly how the trust was designed to function. The room fell silent again. Outside, the courthouse lawn remained peaceful and unchanged. A few people crossed the street carrying briefcases while a breeze scattered yellow leaves along the sidewalk. Inside the conference room, however, the atmosphere felt very different from when we first arrived. Daniel leaned forward with both elbows on the table and stared at the papers as if trying to imagine how the next several years might unfold under these conditions. Emily sat perfectly still beside him, her confident posture now replaced with careful calculation. I continued watching the sunlight move slowly across the table. For the first time since that evening dinner conversation, the balance inside the room had shifted. Harold's quiet planning from years ago had finally entered the present moment. Daniel eventually looked up again, his voice softer than before. Mommy said slowly, I guess we need to talk about what happens next. I met his eyes calmly without raising my voice. That might be a good idea, I replied. Mr. Carter closed the folder and placed both hands on the table. I will leave the three of you to discuss the matter privately, he said as he stood from his chair. The attorney walked toward the door and paused briefly before leaving the room. The door closed softly behind him, leaving only the three of us sitting together in the quiet conference room while the implications of the trust agreement settled into the space between us. For several seconds no one spoke. Daniel looked at the document again. Emily stared at the window, and I sat quietly remembering the day Harold first told me that some plans only reveal their purpose years later when the right moment finally arrives. The conference room remained quiet long after Mr. Carter closed the door behind him. The sound of the latch settling into place echoed softly through the room, leaving only the faint hum of the air conditioning and the distant traffic outside the courthouse windows. Daniel was the first to move. He leaned forward again, studying the trust document as if the explanation might somehow change if he read the lines more carefully. Emily sat beside him with her arms crossed, her eyes fixed on the same page, but her expression far more guarded. I remained in my chair near the window, watching the afternoon sunlight shift slowly across the polished wooden table. For many years I had sat in that same room beside Harold while he spoke with Mr. Carter about paperwork and long-term plans. At the time, I had not paid much attention to the details. Harold had always been the one who enjoyed organizing things carefully. Daniel finally broke the silence. "Mom," he said quietly, "did you know about this trust before today?" I turned my eyes toward him and answered calmly, "Your father mentioned it to me many years ago." Emily straightened immediately. "You knew about it," she said sharply. I nodded once. Harold believed the house should always remain a place where I could live safely, no matter what happened in the future. Daniel looked down again at the document. "I wish he had explained that to me earlier," he said. Emily leaned forward with a measured tone. "Margaret, if the trust requires your approval for refinancing, then perhaps we can simply review the plans together." Daniel glanced at her and then back toward me. "Yes, Mom," he added carefully. "The renovation and refinancing would increase the property value and give us more options in the future." I folded my hands quietly on the table. "And how would that benefit me?" The question hung in the air longer than either of them expected. Emily hesitated before answering. "Well, it would improve the house," she said. "New kitchen cabinets, updated flooring, better appliances." Daniel nodded quickly. "It would make the house more comfortable." I looked from one of them to the other. For several seconds no one spoke again. Outside, the courthouse lawn remained calm as a light breeze moved through the trees, scattering a few more leaves across the sidewalk. Finally, I spoke again. "Harold built that kitchen himself nearly 30 years ago," I said. Daniel blinked. "I know, but times change, Mom. Renovations are normal." I nodded slowly. "That may be true." Emily leaned closer to the table again. "Margaret, we are not trying to take anything away from you," she said. "We are just trying to move forward." Daniel nodded in agreement. "Exactly. The refinancing would allow us to improve the house and eventually move to a larger place once the value increases." I noticed the way Emily's eyes brightened slightly when Daniel mentioned moving. I had heard the same excitement in her voice a few days earlier when she thought no one else was listening. I rested my hands gently on the table. "The trust requires that any financial decision must benefit me," I said calmly. Emily forced a small smile. "Of course it will." Daniel leaned back in his chair again, clearly hoping the conversation would resolve quickly. Be rushed. Emily exhaled slowly, as if trying to remain patient. Daniel gathered the documents into the folder again and stood up from his chair. "Perhaps we should go home and discuss everything more carefully," he said. Emily nodded reluctantly and stood beside him. "We can figure out the details tonight," she added. We left the conference room together and walked down the narrow staircase toward the street outside. The afternoon air felt cooler than before, and the sound of traffic filled the quiet space between the buildings. Daniel unlocked the car and opened the passenger door for Emily while I took my seat in the back again. The drive home felt longer than the drive to the office. Daniel focused on the road while Emily looked silently out the window beside him. Neither of them spoke much during the ride. When we finally pulled into the driveway, the maple tree in the front yard stood quietly beneath the fading sunlight, its red leaves glowing softly against the gray sky. Daniel turned off the engine and sat for a moment with both hands resting on the steering wheel. While he said quietly, "We will figure this out together." Emily opened the car door without replying and walked toward the front porch. I stepped out slowly and looked up at the branches of the maple tree above the yard. Harold always believed that patience reveals truths people overlook when they rush ahead. As I followed Daniel toward the front door, I could feel the balance inside the house shifting once again. Because for the first time since they believed the house belonged entirely to them, Daniel and Emily understood that every decision about its future would now pass through me. That evening the house felt quieter than it had in years, but it was not the comfortable quiet I remembered from when Harold was alive. This silence carried tension, the kind that settles slowly into the corners of a room when people realize the future is no longer unfolding the way they expected. When we walked inside, Daniel placed the folder of trust documents on the kitchen counter and ran his hand across the back of his neck the way he used to when he felt uncertain about something important. Emily set her purse on the table and walked straight to the living room window, staring out toward the maple tree. In the front yard, as if the branches might hold some answer she had not considered before. I hung my coat by the door and moved calmly into the kitchen. The familiar smell of coffee grounds and wooden cabinets greeted me the same way it had for decades. For a moment, I simply stood there remembering how Harold used to lean against the counter every evening while we talked about the day. Daniel eventually walked in behind me and pulled out a chair at the table. Mommy said quietly, "We should talk about what happens next." Emily followed a moment later and sat across from him, her expression composed but far more careful than it had been earlier in the week. I poured a fresh cup of coffee and sat down across from them both. The folder containing the trust agreement rested between us like a silent reminder that the balance inside the house had shifted. Daniel opened the folder again and looked at the same pages he had studied all afternoon. "I still cannot believe Dad set this up without telling me," he said. Emily leaned forward and folded her hands together on the table. "What matters now is how we move forward," she said. "Margaret, the trust requires your approval for any major financial decision involving the house. If we work together, we can still refinance and complete the renovation plans." I listened carefully without interrupting. Outside the kitchen window, the maple tree rustled softly as the evening wind moved through its red leaves. The branches had grown wide over the years, stretching across the yard the way Harold always said they would. Daniel looked at me again with a hopeful expression. "Mom, the renovation would make the house more comfortable for everyone," he said. "We could modernize the kitchen, open up the living space, maybe even increase the property value enough to move somewhere larger later." Emily nodded in agreement. "It is a practical decision," she added. "Houses need to evolve over time." I rested my hands quietly around the warm coffee mug before speaking. "Your father believed the house already served its purpose exactly as it was," I said. Emily shifted slightly in her chair. "With respect, Margaret, the house is older now. Improvements are necessary if it is going to remain valuable." Daniel looked between the two of us, clearly hoping the conversation would remain calm. "Mom, what would make you comfortable with the refinancing?" he asked carefully. I watched them both for a moment before answering. "Harold created that trust for a reason," I said. Daniel nodded slowly. "To protect you." "Yes," I replied. "And protection means making decisions that truly benefit me, not simply decisions that are convenient for someone else." Emily's expression tightened again, but she kept her voice steady. "The renovation would benefit you too," she said. "The house would be easier to maintain and more modern." I shook my head gently. "The kitchen Harold built still works perfectly," I said. "The floors still hold every memory of this family." Daniel sighed quietly. "Mom, we are not trying to erase the past. We just want to build a future." I met his eyes calmly. Sometimes the future should grow from the past instead of replacing it. The room fell silent again. Daniel leaned back in his chair while Emily stared at the documents on the table. I could see them both realizing that the conversation was no longer about paperwork or renovation plans. It was about something much deeper than that. After a few minutes, Daniel spoke again, his voice softer now. "What do you want to do with the house, Mom?" The question hung in the air like a turning point neither of them had expected to reach so quickly. I took a slow sip of coffee before answering. "I want the house to remain exactly what your father intended it to be," I said. "A home where I can live peacefully for as long as I need to." Emily exhaled slowly. "And the refinancing?" I placed the coffee mug down on the table and looked directly at both of them. "I will not approve the refinancing," I said calmly. For a moment, neither of them reacted. Daniel blinked as if trying to process the words while Emily's posture stiffened slightly in her chair. Daniel spoke first. "Mom, are you sure about that?" "Yes," I replied. "The trust requires that any financial decision must serve my best interest. Borrowing against the house to fund renovations and future plans does not serve that purpose." Emily finally leaned forward again. "But that means we cannot move forward with the improvements or the refinancing at all." I nodded gently. "That is correct." The silence that followed felt very different from the earlier silence in Mr. Carter's office. This time the truth was clear enough that none of us needed another explanation. Daniel looked down at the trust documents again, slowly closing the folder as he did so. "I suppose Dad knew exactly what he was doing," he said quietly. I looked toward the window where the maple tree stood tall against the darkening sky. Harold always believed that careful planning protects the people you love, even when they do not realize they need protection yet. Outside, the evening wind moved softly through the leaves while the house remained steady around us, just as it had for decades. And as Daniel and Emily sat across from me at the kitchen table, finally understanding that the future of the house would not unfold the way they once imagined, I realized that Harold's quiet promise to keep me safe inside these walls had been fulfilled exactly the way he intended.